The air in the great hall of Silverwood was thick with the scent of spiced wine and ambition. It clung to the velvet draperies and settled in the lungs, a cloying perfume of power and desperation. For Alara, it was the smell of a cage. She stood on the raised dais, a single, silent figure in a plain gray shift. Her hands clasped before her not in supplication, but in a quiet effort to still their trembling. This was the third time. 3 times before she had turned 20, she had been a line item in a ledger, a bargaining chip, a piece of living currency. Her alpha, a portly man named Lord Fendrel with sweating palms and shifting eyes, was extolling her virtues to the assembled pack leaders. He spoke of her docile nature, her obedience, her proven health. He did not mention her spirit, for he had never seen it. He did not speak of her mind, for he had never thought to ask its contents. He was a merchant selling a fine, if unremarkable, piece of livestock. Across the hall, her half-sister Lyra watched with a triumphant smirk. Lyra, resplendent in crimson silk and jewels that caught the torchlight, was the prize of their family. An alpha-born daughter, strong and beautiful. Alara was the omega, the quiet shame, the inconvenient reminder of their mother's second, lesser pairing. Lyra's gaze was a physical weight, a familiar pressure of contempt that had followed Alara all her life. Tonight, that contempt was sharpened by the public nature of the spectacle. Alara kept her own eyes fixed on a point just beyond the crowd, a knot in the dark wood of the far wall. She had learned long ago that to meet their gazes, the curious, the pitying, the predatory, was to give them a piece of herself she could not spare. She focused on the wood grain, on the slow, steady beat of her own heart. They could sell her body. They could trade her future. They could not have the last, inviolable fortress of her mind. This was her strength, unseen and unvalued. A refusal to break where they expected her to crumble. From his throne of obsidian and iron, King Kalin observed the proceedings with an apathy honed over 5 centuries of existence. His kingdom was a mosaic of territories, each governed by an alpha who owed him fealty. These annual pact sealings were a necessary chore, a tedious ritual of politics and posturing. He watched them trade land, resources, and sometimes their own people, and felt nothing. A curse did not allow for feeling. The frost heart, as the whispers named it, was a creeping glaciation of the soul. It had been laid upon him generations ago, a sorceress's final, vengeful act. It leached the warmth from his blood, the color from his world, and the emotion from his heart, replacing it all with a profound, unending cold. A fine layer of frost perpetually coated the arms of his throne, unmelted by the roaring fires in the hearths. His subjects saw a king of immense power and unnerving stillness. They saw control. They did not see the cage of ice he inhabited. He was a ghost in his own life, a spectator to the vibrant tapestry of existence. He felt no joy, no rage, no grief. There was only the cold, and a distant academic awareness of what he was supposed to be. A king, an alpha, a ruler. The titles were hollow echoes in the silent cavern of his being. His gaze swept the hall, cataloging the shifting alliances and simmering feuds. Then, it stopped. It settled on the dais where Lord Fendrel was concluding his sale. It was not the Omega herself that caught his eye. Not at first. It was the quality of the silence around her. In a hall buzzing with whispers and clinking goblets, she was an island of absolute stillness. He looked closer. She was not defiant in the way of a snarling wolf backed into a corner. Her chin was not lifted in challenge. Her power was of a different kind. It was in the straightness of her spine, the quiet dignity of her posture. She was a stone in a rushing river, unmoved by the current that sought to drag her under. While the world appraised her, she simply was. And then, for the first time in centuries, something moved within him. It was not an emotion. He had forgotten what those felt like. It was something more primal. A deep, seismic tremor in the permafrost of his soul. His inner wolf, a creature long dormant and buried under leagues of ice, lifted its head. It recognized something. A scent on the air that was not perfume or wine, but something elemental, like sun-warmed earth after a rain. Mate, the word was not a thought, but an instinct. A crack in the ice so profound, it nearly stole his breath. Lord Fendrel named the final price, a handsome sum of land rights on the northern border, offered by a grizzled alpha from the Stonefang pack. A murmur of approval went through the crowd. A good trade. A fair price. The transaction was complete. Papers were produced, a contract of ownership. As the Stonefang Alpha approached the dais to claim his purchase, King Kalen rose. The movement was fluid and silent, yet it silenced the entire hall as effectively as a thunderclap. Every eye snapped to the obsidian throne. The king never interfered in pack business. Never. He descended the steps, his silver-embroidered black tunic absorbing the light. The faint, chilling aura that always surrounded him intensified, and the temperature in the hall dropped by several degrees. Alphas twice his size instinctively took a step back, their posturing forgotten in the face of true, absolute authority. Kalen walked not to Lord Fendrel, nor to the buyer. He walked directly to the scribe holding the contract. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand. The scribe, trembling, handed over the parchment. Kalen's eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the document. His expression was, as always, unreadable, a mask of cold neutrality. But those closest to him, the ones who had served him for decades, saw something new. A dangerous stillness. A focus so intense it seemed to burn. He looked from the paper to the Omega. Alara finally broke her gaze from the far wall and looked at him. Her eyes were not brown, as he had first assumed, but a startling shade of amber, like honey with sunlight trapped inside. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, weary watchfulness. She did not cower. She did not plead. She simply met his gaze, and in that moment the world narrowed to the space between them. He looked back at the contract in his hand. The words swam before him. Sold. Ownership. Property. A sudden, alien heat flared in his chest. It was not warmth. It was rage, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. This stillness, this quiet dignity, this soul that his own had recognized across a crowded hall, it could not be owned. It would not be owned. With a deliberate, precise motion, he tore the parchment in half. The sound ripped through the stunned silence of the hall. Then, he tore it again. And again. He let the pieces flutter from his fingers like dead leaves. He turned his gaze upon Lord Fendrel, and for the first time, the portly Alpha understood true fear. It was not the roaring fury of a common Alpha. It was the absolute, unyielding cold of a glacier. "She is not for sale," Kalen stated. His voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of the room, a low command that brooked no argument. He looked at the Stonefang Alpha. "The deal is void." He looked at the entire assembly. No more. It was not a negotiation. It was a decree. He turned back to Alara. For a moment, he just looked at her, and the silent, frozen part of him felt an overwhelming, incomprehensible urge to protect. To shield this small, steady flame from the winds that sought to extinguish it. "You will come with me," he said. It was not a command. It was a statement of fact, as inevitable as the rising of the moon. The journey to the Frost Spire Citadel was a silent one. Alara sat across from the king in his carriage, the rhythmic clopping of the hooves and the creak of the leather, the only sounds between them. He did not speak to her, merely watched, his pale eyes intense and unnerving. She should have been terrified. She was being taken from the only world she knew, by a man who was more legend than Alpha, a king wreathed in rumors of ice and death. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm. The fear that had been her constant companion for years, the fear of the next blow, the next sale, the next humiliation, had receded. In its place was a vast, uncertain quiet. Whatever lay ahead could not be worse than the slow, grinding erosion of her soul she had endured thus far. The citadel rose from the mountains like a shard of black ice. It was a fortress of severe, imposing beauty, its towers piercing the clouds. As they passed through the gates, the air grew colder, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. It radiated from the very stones of the castle. It radiated from the king himself. Inside, the halls were vast and silent, lined with dark, polished stone that reflected the cool, white light from high, narrow windows. There were no tapestries, no splashes of color. It was a place stripped of warmth, of life, a monument to emptiness. Kaelin led her to a suite of rooms in the western wing. They were spacious, even luxurious, with a canopied bed and finely carved furniture. But the cold permeated everything. A fire was laid in the hearth, but it seemed to give off no heat. "This will be yours," he said, his voice flat. "You are not a prisoner. You may go where you wish within the castle walls. You will be provided for." Elara looked around the room, then back at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. It was the first word she had spoken to him. The simple question seemed to catch him off guard. He stared at her, his brows knitting together in a faint line. "I do not abide by the selling of wolves," he said, the answer sounding rehearsed. Political, she held his gaze, her amber eyes unwavering. She knew that was not the whole truth. She had seen other Omegas traded at these gatherings. He had never intervened before. Something about her, about that moment, had been different. But she did not press. She simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Majesty." The formal title seemed out of place in the stark intimacy of the moment. He inclined his head and left, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft click, leaving her alone in the cold, silent splendor. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Kaelin watched her. He was a constant, silent presence. Sometimes she would look up from a book in the vast, frigid library to find him standing in the shadows of a far archway. Other times, she would feel his eyes on her as she walked the battlements, looking out over the snow-dusted peaks. He never approached, never spoke. He just observed. Elara, in turn, observed him. She saw the way the servants flinched when he passed, the way the guards stiffened to attention. She saw the fine sheen of frost that sometimes appeared on his gauntlets, even indoors. She saw the profound, bone-deep weariness in him when he thought no one was looking. He was not just a king, he was a man carrying a weight too heavy to be borne. Her presence did not go unnoticed by the court. Whispers followed her down the corridors. The king's Omega, a low-born nobody he had plucked from obscurity. What was her game? What power did she hold over him? The whispers found a voice in Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor. He was a tall, severe man with eyes like chips of flint. He saw Elara not as a person, but as a disruption, a dangerous variable in the carefully controlled equation of the kingdom. "Your Majesty," Valerius said, cornering Kaelin in the council chamber one evening, "the court is unsettled. Your guest. It is unseemly. She has no rank, no lineage. To elevate an Omega in this manner undermines the very structure of our society. It makes you look weak." "She is under my protection," Kaelin stated, his voice dangerously low. The temperature in the room dropped further. "That is all the rank she requires. Protection is one thing. This obsession is another, Valerius pressed, emboldened by years of service. You spend your days watching her. The northern border negotiations falter, and you are distracted by a nameless girl. This is not the behavior of the king I have served. What has she done to you? She makes me feel, Kalen thought, but the concept was so alien he could not give it voice. He could not explain the crack in the ice, the stirring of the wolf. He could not explain how the sound of her turning a page in the library was the most significant event in his day. So he said nothing. Be wary, my king, Valerius warned. Some things are best left frozen. Alara found him late one night in the throne room. She had been unable to sleep, the oppressive silence of the castle a weight on her chest. Drawn by an instinct she did not understand, she had walked the cold halls until she found herself at the great iron-bound doors. Inside, the chamber was colder than the mountain peak beyond the walls. The air was crystalline with frost. Kalen sat on his throne, but he was not the composed king from the hall. He was slumped, his head in one hand, his posture one of utter agony. A thick layer of ice, like a living thing, was crawling up the obsidian throne, encasing its base. It crept over his boots, up his legs, glittering malevolently in the moonlight that streamed through the high windows. His breathing was shallow, ragged puffs of white vapor. For a moment, she hesitated. This was a private pain, a vulnerability she had no right to witness. The king was in the grip of his curse, the legendary Frostheart made manifest. Anyone else would have fled. Alara walked forward. The cold bit at her, sharp and painful, but she ignored it. She stopped a few feet from the dais, her simple woolen nightgown a stark contrast to the frozen grandeur of the scene. He did not seem to notice her. His focus was entirely inward, a battle against an enemy that lived inside his own skin. She did not ask what was wrong. She could see what was wrong. Instead, she asked the one question no one in his entire lonely existence had ever thought to voice. It was direct, honest, and stripped of all artifice. Are you in pain? The words, soft as they were, shattered the suffocating silence. Kalen's head snapped up. His eyes, rimmed with frost, widened in shock. He stared at her as if she were an apparition. For centuries people had feared him, revered him, obeyed him, and plotted against him. No one had ever simply asked after his well-being. The question was a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut long ago. A tremor ran through him, a violent shudder that cracked the ice forming on his tunic. He tried to compose himself, to rebuild the mask of cold authority, but the agony was too great, and her unexpected sincerity had breached his defenses. Always, he rasped, the single word a confession torn from the depths of his soul. He expected her to recoil, to offer useless pity or foolish advice. He expected fear. He was a monster in the throes of his own monstrousness. Alara did none of those things. She took another step closer, her gaze filled not with pity, but with a profound and startling empathy. She looked at the ice, at the throne, at the centuries of solitude etched onto his face, and she understood, not the curse, not the magic, but the core of it, the loneliness. You must have been so alone, she said, her voice a thread of warmth in the frozen air. That simple statement of fact undid him. It struck him with more force than any blade. It was not an accusation or a question, but a quiet acknowledgement of a truth he had lived with for so long he had forgotten it could be seen by another. The ice around his heart, the true, metaphorical ice of his curse, fractured. A single, frozen tear traced a path down his cheek, the first he had shed in 500 years. He began to speak. The words came haltingly at first, then like a river breaking through a dam. He told her everything. About the sorceress who had loved him, and whom he, in his youthful arrogance, had betrayed. About her dying curse, that his heart would feel the same cold he had shown her. He spoke of the long gray centuries, of watching generations of his people live and die, of watching the world bloom in colors he could not see, of hearing laughter that was only a sound, devoid of joy. He spoke of the constant, gnawing cold, and the fear that one day it would consume him entirely, leaving nothing but a statue of ice on a lonely throne. Elara listened. She did not interrupt. She did not judge. She simply stood before him, a steadfast witness to his long-hidden agony. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and hollowed out by the confession, the ice had receded slightly. The air in the room was still painfully cold, but the suffocating pressure had lessened. He looked at her, truly looked at her, vulnerable and exposed for the first time in his life. "Why are you not afraid?" "The cold is just a thing," she replied softly. "I have known the cruelty of people. It is a far worse chill. You are not cruel. You are just, trapped." In that moment, she was no longer his guest, his ward, or a mystery to be solved. She was the first person to see the man behind the monster. And for Kaelin, that was a light so bright it was almost painful. A fragile hope began to take root in the frozen wasteland of his heart. It was a terrifying, unfamiliar sensation. He found himself seeking her out, not just to watch, but to be near. They spent hours in the library, not speaking, but sharing the silence. She would read, and the soft rustle of the pages was a balm to his tormented spirit. He would attend to his paperwork, and the simple fact of her presence in the same room made the task bearable. One evening, she found a book of old poetry. She began to read aloud, her voice low and steady. The words were about sunlight, and harvest, and warmth. Things Kaelin only knew as abstract concepts. But hearing them in her voice, he could almost remember. He could almost feel the sun on his skin. He was sitting in a chair near the fire, which for once seemed to be giving off a pale warmth that reached him. He had closed his eyes, listening to the cadence of her speech. He must have drifted off, for he was startled awake by a touch. Elara had knelt beside his chair. A tremor had been running through his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. A faint, spidery web of frost was forming on his skin. Without thinking, she had reached out and covered his hand with her own. Her touch was electric. It was not just the physical contact, the first gentle touch he had received in living memory. It was the warmth, a deep, impossible heat that flowed from her skin into his. It did not just melt the frost on the surface, it seemed to sink into his very bones, pushing back the ancient internal cold. It was life, it was sun, it was everything he had lost. He gasped, his eyes flying open. He looked down at their joined hands. Where her fingers covered his skin was returning to a normal color, the bluish, translucent tint of the curse fading. The wolf inside him surged, recognizing the feeling, the source. Mate, healer, ours, but hope was a poison to the curse. The magic that bound him, dormant and slow-moving for so long, recognized a true threat. It reacted with vicious, desperate violence. A wave of cold so intense, it was like a physical blow slammed through Kaelin. It was 1,000 times worse than the nightly agony in the throne room. He cried out, a raw, strangled sound, and ripped his hand away from hers as if he had been burned. "Get back," he snarled, the voice not entirely his own. It was deeper, harsher, the voice of the frost itself. He stumbled to his feet, backing away from her. The ice was no longer creeping. It was exploding from him. It sheeted across the floor, encasing the leg of a table in thick, white rime. Frost climbed the walls, covering the stones in intricate, deadly patterns. His own body was being consumed. The ice crawled up his arms, turning his skin to a frozen, crystalline blue. It cracked and groaned with his every ragged breath. Alara stared, her heart pounding with terror. Not for herself, but for him. The pain on his face was inhuman. This was not the slow erosion he had described. This was a violent, final consumption. The hope she had given him was killing him. "Kaelin," she cried, taking a step forward. "Stay away." He roared, clutching his chest. "It will freeze you too. You have to leave." The effort to speak, to warn her, cost him dearly. He collapsed to one knee, his body stiffening, the frost now reaching his neck, his jaw. His eyes, fixed on her, were filled with a desperate, agonizing plea. He had pushed her away to save her. The gesture, so selfless in his final moments, was the most profound feeling he had ever known. And it was the final trigger. The curse, fed by this powerful emotion, surged for the final kill. The throne room was an ice cavern. Kaelin knelt at the foot of his obsidian throne, now more statue than man. The crystalline frost had encased him to his chest, his movements sluggish, his breathing a faint, agonizing rasp. The very air was a weapon, each breath driving shards of cold deeper into his lungs. He was dying. He could feel his consciousness fading. The long, gray nothingness he had inhabited for centuries finally rising up to claim him completely. His last coherent thought was of her amber eyes, the warmth of her hand. It was a bitter, beautiful thing to have found her only to be destroyed by the hope she represented. A fitting end. "Is it not?" A voice echoed in the frozen chamber. Lord Valerius stepped from behind a pillar, his robes immaculate, his expression one of cold satisfaction. He seemed unaffected by the lethal temperature, a king, frozen by his own folly. Alara, who had followed Kaelin's stumbling retreat to the throne room, stood near the entrance, her body trembling with a cold that was now secondary to her fear for him. "What have you done?" she breathed. "I have done nothing but maintain the order of things," Valerius said calmly, walking towards the throne. This curse was a gift. It made him strong, decisive, unburdened by sentiment. It made this kingdom powerful. A king who does not feel cannot be compromised. He gestured to Kaelin's frozen form. "You, with your warmth and your misplaced compassion, you are a disease. You introduced a fever into the system. The curse is merely purging the infection." "You knew," Alara whispered, understanding dawning. "You have been helping it." "Helping it?" "My dear girl, my family created it," Valerius corrected her with a thin smile. "The sorceress was my ancestor. She ensured her legacy would live on, a warden to keep this bloodline in check. For generations, my family has advised the Frostspire kings, subtly reinforcing the chill, ensuring no flicker of warmth could ever take root. Until you." Kaelin heard the words through a haze of encroaching darkness. Valerius, the betrayal was a distant, dull ache, nothing compared to the agony of the ice. He tried to move, to fight, but his limbs were no longer his own. He could only watch as Valerius turned his flinty eyes on Alara. "He is lost," the advisor said. "But you are not. Your unique quality is of interest. Leave this place. Let him become the monument he was always meant to be, and I will see to it you are given wealth, status, a place of your own." He offered her a choice between a comfortable life and a lost cause. He offered her vengeance on the king who had taken her, a man who was now dying before her eyes. Alara looked at Kaelin, at the man encased in the glittering armor of his own curse, his life slipping away. She saw not a king, not a monster, but the lonely soul who had confessed his pain to her. The man who had touched her hand and felt warmth for the first time. The man who, in his final moments, had pushed her away to save her. Vengeance? Wealth? They were meaningless ashes. All that mattered was the steady, burning warmth in her own chest. A warmth that was now screaming in protest at the encroaching cold. No, she said, her voice ringing with newfound power. She chose love. She chose healing. And in that moment, as she stepped toward Kalen, something inside her broke free. The imminent loss of him, the man her very soul recognized as its other half, was the final key. A dormant power, a heritage she never knew she possessed, awakened within her. A soft golden light began to emanate from her skin. It started as a faint aura, then intensified, pouring from her in waves of tangible heat. The killing frost on the floor hissed and retreated from her steps. The air around her grew warm, fragrant with the scent of sun-drenched blossoms. She was not just warm, she was warmth itself. The last of the sun touched Omegas, a lineage thought lost to time, born with the pure essence of life and light, the curse's perfect and absolute antithesis. Valerius stared, his composure finally shattering. Impossible, he stammered, shielding his eyes from the light. They were all destroyed. Elara ignored him. Her focus was entirely on Kalen. She reached the dais, and without hesitation, placed her glowing hands on his frozen chest. The impact was explosive. Light met dark. Fire met ice. A shockwave of energy erupted from the point of contact, throwing Valerius back against a pillar. The throne room was filled with a blinding golden radiance and the sound of 1,000 glaciers cracking at once. Kalen felt it not as an attack, but as a homecoming. The light, the warmth, it poured into him, seeking out the ancient cold magic coiled around his heart. It did not fight the curse, it consumed it. It melted the ice in his veins, thawed the frost on his soul, and reignited the pilot light of his emotions. He gasped, a true deep breath of warm air. Color flooded his vision, the rich gold of Elara's light, the deep black of the obsidian, the startling crimson of a banner he had never truly seen before. Sensation returned in a dizzying rush, the feel of the cold stone beneath his knees, the texture of his tunic, the gentle pressure of Elara's hands on his chest. And with it, feeling, gratitude, so immense it was a physical ache, awe at the miracle before him. And love, a vast, overwhelming, all-consuming love for the woman who was saving him, who was his salvation. The ice encasing his body shattered, falling away in a cascade of glittering dust. He was left kneeling, free, breathing, and whole. He looked up at Elara, her face illuminated by her own inner light, and knew he was looking at his queen, his mate, his entire world. The curse was broken. With a final defiant pulse, the golden light from Elara faded, leaving the throne room warmed and silent. The last vestiges of frost on the walls melted away, running down the stone like tears. Kalen rose to his feet, his movements fluid and sure. The weariness of centuries had vanished from his face, replaced by a raw, breathtaking vitality. He felt the steady, strong beat of his own heart, a rhythm he had not been aware of for most of his life. It was beating for her. Valerius, slumped against the pillar, could only stare in horror. His life's work, his family's legacy of control, had been undone in a matter of moments by a girl with sunshine in her veins. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Kalen answered for her. He turned to his former advisor, and his eyes, no longer the color of a winter sky but a deep, clear gray, held a power far more formidable than the cold ever had. It was the power of a king fully realized, of an alpha who had found his purpose. "She is my queen," he said, his voice resonating with an authority that left no room for doubt. "And you are a traitor." He made a simple gesture to the guards who had rushed in, drawn by the commotion. "Take him to the dungeons. He will await my judgment." The guards, their faces a mixture of fear and awe, did as they were commanded, dragging the now powerless Valerius away. Then, they were alone. Kaelin turned back to Alara. She looked exhausted, the expenditure of her power having left her pale, but her amber eyes were bright. He took a step towards her, then another, until he was standing before her. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently cupped her cheek. His skin was warm. "Alara," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. He had never truly felt what it was to love until this moment, and the force of it was staggering. It was more terrifying and more wonderful than any curse. "You saved me. You saved me first," she replied softly, leaning into his touch. He shook his head. "I merely moved you from one cage to another. You freed me." He searched her face, needing her to understand the totality of his transformation, the depth of his gratitude. "Everything. I can feel everything. The warmth of your hand, the air in my lungs. My heart. Alara, my heart is beating your name." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence. It was a promise, a vow, a declaration. It was the first kiss he had ever truly felt, and in it he poured 500 years of loneliness, a lifetime of newfound hope, and a love that was already as deep and unshakable as the mountains around them. Their union was declared before the entire court the following week. Alara stood beside him, not in a simple gray shift, but in a gown of deep gold that shimmered like the sun. She was not his omega, not his property. She was his partner, his queen, the sun-touched ruler of the Frost Spire Citadel. The court, seeing their king vibrant and alive for the first time, and feeling the genuine warmth that now filled the castle, roared its approval. The age of ice was over. 3 months later, Alara stood on a balcony overlooking a garden that was now impossibly in full bloom. Roses and star blossoms thrived where only snow had lain for centuries. Kaelin came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. The chill was gone from him entirely, replaced by a steady, comforting warmth that was now the defining feature of their home. "A letter came for you," he said quietly, holding out a piece of parchment. She recognized the seal of her old pack. She took it, her fingers steady as she broke the wax. The letter was from her half-sister, Lyra. It was a pathetic, rambling screed. Lord Fendrel had been ruined by the king's disfavor. Their family had lost all its standing. Lyra wrote of her regret, of her admiration, begging for a position in the queen's new court, for any scrap of the power Alara now held. It was a plea born not of remorse, but of envy and desperation. Alara read the letter through once, her expression calm. The words, which once would have been barbs of either triumph or pain, were now meaningless. Lyra and that part of her life belonged to a different world, to a person she no longer was. She walked over to the small brazier that burned on the balcony, its flames dancing in the crisp mountain air. Kaelin watched, saying nothing, trusting her completely. She held the parchment to the fire. She watched as her sister's desperate, grasping words blackened, curled, and turned to ash. The wind caught the fragile remnants and scattered them over the blooming gardens below. She was free. Kaelin tightened his embrace, kissing the side of her neck. "Is everything all right?" She leaned back against his chest, her heart full and steady. "Everything," she said, turning her head to kiss him, "is perfect." The past was ash, and before them lay a future as bright and as warm as the sun.